So far, we've been looking exclusively at the second person volative forms, which we call the imperative. Before we move on and look at the exercises, we're going to briefly, emphasis on briefly, deal with the third person volative forms, which we call jussives, and the first person volative forms that we call cohortatives. Let's take a look here. This should be familiar to you. Now, we've got, this is the same verb chart of the imperfect that we've seen before. And like the third person, or excuse me, like the second person volatives, the imperatives, the third person volatives are closely related to the imperfect forms. So let's take the imperfect form first. What's the imperfect third masculine singular from Katal? Yik, tol. Okay. Third feminine singular? Okay. This shouldn't be hard. Now, because we're only concerned now with the third persons, let's skip to the plural. Third person plural? Good. Yik, chalu. And the third person feminine plural. Tick, tol. No. Yeah. Tick, tol, not. Too many dots there. I'm out of control.
Comments.
Comments. Thank you. Tick, tol, not. All right. Tick, yeah, accent. Got it. Don't get carried away. All right. Now, how do we make the volative, the third person volative forms, the jussive forms from these? Well, how did you make the second person forms? You lopped off the prefixes. So how are you going to make the third person forms? You're going to do nothing at all. Yeah, third person, the jussive forms look exactly the same as the imperfect forms. So these are the jussive forms for the most part, except for a few minor variations, which we'll deal with in a moment. Now the question arises, how do you know then if the forms are exactly the same, if yik tol can be either he will kill or let him kill or may he kill, expression of will, how are you going to know the difference? How are you going to know when it's one or the other?
Context.
Yeah, only the context. We do that a lot in Hebrew. That's why Hebrew is more of an art than a science in translation. For one thing, jussive forms are almost always used in quotations, okay? Because after all, if someone if someone is expressing their will, he's going to be saying, "Let us go to the grocery store." That's almost always going to be in a quotation of some sort. So that's one way in which context will help you. But the fact is, the only way that you'll know whether you're working with an imperfect or a jussive form is from the context. Now, these were, in fact, originally independent forms, and I won't bore you with the history of this. Originally, jussives were shortened forms of the imperfect, back when the imperfect forms were longer. Remember, we had that discussion when we were talking about the predicate, or rather the preterite, that originally the imperfect forms in Hebrew were longer forms, and they've gotten apocryphated or shortened over time. Well, the jussive forms were used to be shorter forms of the imperfect, but by the time we get to biblical Hebrew, they are the same, indistinguishable, except in two types of verbs, two types of weak verbs, third hay verbs and hollow verbs. So only in third hay verbs and hollow verbs can you tell the difference between jussive forms and imperfect forms. So let's look at those first, shall we? Let's look first at the third hay forms. Again, we're talking about the third person forms only. So if we're going to work with bana as our example, third hay type form, the imperfect third masculine singular would be what? Well, we can get our consonants here anyway. How's this? Yiv. And remember, in the imperfect, The hey takes this segol ending, yivneh, okay? And the third person feminine form then is, should be able to get it, the rest of it now,